Hello Internet, and welcome to a video where I am going to go to the American continent for a while. I know I have spent a lot of time in Europe, and to my American friends, I am a bit sorry about that, because I do love your nation, your history, and your everything. But in this case, I'm not going to talk about the modern American nations, no. I am going to speak about the Cherokee Indians, and more specifically, how warlike they were, because, the Cherokees are one of my favorite native tribes, and I want to talk about their martial glory, something that I feel isn't often mentioned when, talk falls on them. So, yeah, enjoy. The Cherokees was one of the most powerful Native American tribes in the eastern American states. They covered a massive area that basically included parts of the states of Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, several others, with interest ranging all the way up to southern New York in some cases and hitting the Great Lakes. And how did they manage to maintain such an area? Well, obviously, they had numbers on their side for a while, until introduction of various epidemics in the 15th, 16th century. There are indications that they might have had more than 350,000 members of their tribal confederations. However, of course, numbers alone doesn't do anything. No. The way the Cherokees maintained their areas, and indeed maintained a certain kind of tribal cohesion, was through war, just like basically anyone else. And I realized that when you talk about Native American wars, you often talk about their battles and struggles against the white man. In this particular case, however, I want to talk about the Cherokee wars against other tribes, because, honestly, it's a fairly interesting subject that I don't see covered a lot of other places. When you go to visit, for instance, Cherokee, you hear about it, and it's not an unknown subject, but I feel like it's something I wanted to cover on my channel, since it's not something that a lot of, shall we call, mainstream history sources deal a lot with. And of course, the main problem is that before contact with the whites, the Cherokee didn't have any kind of written language. That was, in fact, only developed very, very late in tribal history. Nowadays, of course, they have both their own written and spoken language, which is happily rising a bit again. But the point is, getting actual sources for those other tribal wars can be a bit difficult, because you have to go by oral tradition. However, those oral traditions are very rich, and so yeah, I'm going to sort of go over the Cherokee relationship with various tribes that surrounded them, and how they basically spent much of their time fighting with them. So yeah, let's get on with it. The Cherokee has several tribes that could be considered arch enemies. Amongst these were the Catawbas, who was a sort of near enemy and neighbor to the southeast, and they fought several wars and battles between them. Not less because both the Catawbas and the Cherokees claimed various areas of land that they then had to, have a couple of scrap about. In fact, according to Cherokee legends, the Cherokees originally owned the land that the Catawbas lived on, but then pulled out and sort of lent that particular area to the Catawbas, but then later decided they wanted it back, and people started, fighting about it. Around 1708, there were several serious, actually really important battles between the two tribes, with major losses on both sides, without any of them having a sort of real determinate victory, despite the fact that the Catawbas, who was trading with the whites at the coast, were actually armed with gunpowder weaponry, which the Cherokees hadn't really achieved yet at this point. However, Eventually, the fighting ended in a compromise where the Cherokee and the Catawbas sort of split the land between them. The Catawbas could stay east of the Catawba River, and the Cherokees would stay west of Broad River, and the area between the two rivers could be a sort of, no man's land. That ended the wars with the Catawbas for a while, until they decided to have another scrap, and particularly during the French and Indian Wars, or the North American part of the European 7 Years' War, the Catawbas fought with the English against the Cherokees, despite the Cherokees at other places allying with the English against the French. This was really odd, however. Nonetheless, eventually contact with the whites and the constant war had reduced the Catawbas to a fairly small tribe, and eventually they actually moved into Cherokee area to join the Cherokee Confederacy in order to maintain its tribal identity. This didn't, of course, go well, and eventually there was more fighting between the remaining Catawbas and the Cherokees, and the Catawbas eventually moved back into the southern parts of South Carolina. Well, as you can see, the Cherokees did like their fighting, so for more than 100 years they were fighting the Catawbas. However, you can't fight with the same people all the time, so during the periods when they didn't actually have wars with the Catawbas, the Cherokees turned north. Now, north of them were the Shawnees, who were also the Cherokee arch-enemy. Some people believe that the Shawnees had originally lived in Georgia around the Savannah River, but had been migrating north and passing through the Cherokee areas, which would then have given rise to a certain hostility. This is possible, but it would have happened a lot earlier than most tribal traditions say, because in 1660, when white settlers already realized that they were living north of the Cherokee. At any rate, once again, there were some land disputes, and during the times when the Cherokees were not fighting the Catawbas, they then basically fought the Shawnees in the north. So in 1710, just after the sort of First Catawba War, if you can call it that, the Cherokees and the Chickasaws on one side and the Shawnees on another one broke out and fought very, very hard until the Shawnees basically were all driven north to the area around the Ohio River, where they then got protection from the Delaware tribe. This, of course, didn't mean that the hostility ended in any way, because no, you must have struggle and war. There were several larger and smaller battles in the next 50 years or so, which, of course, then led to a Cherokee war with the Delawares, because they were protecting their subordinate tribes, and then the Delaware Wars then kept going as long as the wars with the Shawnees, until sort of a final war in the 1768 time period. However, this was definitely a war that the Cherokees can be said to have won, in as much as they drove the Shawnees away and maintained their sort of land rights. Now, the Delaware War. The story is that after having driven the Shawnees north, the Shawnees, or some Shawnees, then made a raid against some Cherokee tribes, and the Cherokees pursued the Shawnee war party all the way back to their homelands, and then got into conflict with some Delawares who they mistook for Shawnees. So this led basically to a war with the Delawares and the Cherokees, as I already mentioned, and basically they already, since they were already at war with the Shawnees, they basically just continued fighting back and forth until, like I said, in 1768. However, what might be interesting in wars with the Delawares is that at about the same time, the Cherokees made war against the Wyandots, or however they're pronounced, who were in Ohio and Michigan. Now, the Wyandots were a Iroquois people, but not part of the Iroquois Confederacy, that they then had wars with. Now, the Iroquois were, of course, generally on English side during the wars with the French, but the Wyandots were at this time allied with France for some reason. So what basically happened during this particular war period was that the Cherokees were fighting a war with the Delawares and also with the Wyandots, which meant that they were allied at the same time with both France and England, fighting against their various tribal allies and fighting against both the French and the English, depending on which raid that was going out now. Yeah, again, why am I speaking of all these wars? Because I basically like how aggressive the Cherokees was in protecting their given area, how they were very, very strong in making sure that they had a tribal identity that they were protecting, as well as their land area. And the amount of not giving a shit as to who is allied with who, as long as we actually have a decent war we can fight with them, is kind of a good proof about this. We fight with the English now, good. Now we fight with the French. Now we fight with both of them. Now we fight with various Indian enemies. Now we're allied with them against the French because we're fight. Blah 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 blah. The point is, the Cherokee was a warlike people, and I actually like how they were able to maintain such an area by aggressive means. It was kind of like an aggressive defense, and as a military historian, I kind of like that tactic. So, let's go on then. Now, you will remember me telling you that the Cherokees fought with the Catawbas in about 1708, 1711, and after that they then immediately got involved with the wars with the Northern Shawnees. However, immediately at the same time as the Shawnee Wars, the Cherokee also then got embroiled with the Tuscarora War. The Tuscaroras was a tribe also living on the southeastern coast of the United States, and they had involved themselves in various wars with the English, Dutch, and German white settlers at that point. And in this particular war, the Cherokees, mainly probably those who couldn't go north to join the fight with the Shawnees and felt bored, decided to fight on the colonist side against the Tuscaroras. To do that, they then allied with the Catawbas. So yeah, arch enemies or not, let's not ancient enmity get in the way of a decent war. However, the Tuscaroras themselves were split basically into two tribal groups, and eventually the sort of northern group of Tuscaroras then also turned on the southern group of Tuscaroras, and eventually, of course, the wars then went against them until the northern Tuscaroras then moved out of the area and away from the Cherokee sort of immediate area. However, when the colonists then asked the Cherokees to join the peace with the Tuscaroras, they refused, with the simple reason that, you know, they're not a threat to us and we don't need to fight them right now, but, I mean, eventually we'll have to make peace with a lot of other tribes we're currently fighting. So if we keep being at war with the Tuscaroras, we don't actually have to do anything sort of really nasty to them, but it's always nice to have someone around that you can, you know, get into a fight with without actually having to declare a new war first. Yeah, Cherokees. Peaceful and loving of their fellow man, as you can hear. Finally, let's turn to the Creeks. Now, the Creeks was the Cherokee arch-enemy. I have mentioned this name a couple of times before, but admittedly, the Creeks were probably the arch-enemiest arch-enemy the Cherokees had. Because even though the two tribes were, you know, sometimes allied with each other against other tribes, they was basically fighting almost continuously from around maybe 1650 or earlier until at least after the American Revolution. So this is probably a long-standing hostility that maybe came in when the Cherokees originally emigrated to the areas where the Creeks already lived and drove them south. However, 1715, the Cherokees were already in Tuscarora Wars, as the Yamasee Wars, and of course the Northern Shawnee Wars, though that was winding down at the time. They invited some Creek Indians, or rather some Muskogee Indians, that the Creeks were a part of at the time, to a conference. And for some reason, I don't know why, since they were also very peace-loving, during that conference, the Cherokees murdered all the Creek leaders and drove the other participants away, which, of course, started a new war, which lasted for about 50 years. Again, not perhaps constant fighting, but there was always, some raids and struggles and something else. But after a sort of dead period in around 1753, the war really, really got hot again, in so much as the Creek tribe burned down several Cherokee villages in Georgia and then used the Cherokee areas for hunting. The Cherokees disagree with this because they then basically said that while the Creeks did do a certain amount of raids against them, they then went south into Georgia and beat them in a major battle that the Creeks had to leave their own areas and leave that to the Cherokee. Modern day scientist, whites, so, appropriation, feels that both tales are probably correct, in as much that the Creeks probably did take over certain Cherokee areas and even mocked the Cherokees about it, but the Cherokees then won this famous battle, except that they didn't actually win it over the Creek, but rather something called the Apachilicoa tribes, who was allied with French and thus allied with the Creeks. Wars continued sporadically, however, all the way up to 18012, longer than the Cherokees basically fought with any other of their tribal foes, because at that time, of course, conflict with the whites had to a certain degree taken over. However, in 18012, the Creeks and the United States of America went to war, and the Cherokees took the opportunity to ally with the United States to finally finish off their arch enemy. It was at this time that a Cherokee chief declared to his tribal council that he would go to war and not return until the Creeks had been destroyed down to the last man. And in fact, during the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he was very, very close to success, having defeated the Creeks. The Cherokees was just about to commit a major genocidal massacre when Colonel Andrew Jackson, later of course General Jackson, and later of course President Jackson, who apparently maybe from this moment didn't really like the Cherokees, see Trail of Tears, prevented the Cherokees from actually performing this genocide. So the chief, called Gulkalaski, had to return home to North Carolina without achieving his goal, despite what he said. So when he put in his report to the tribal council, he basically just said one word. It's in Cherokee, and it's something like Detsino Lahunga. I can't pronounce it, but it means something like I tried, but I couldn't, which basically gave him the name Yanaluska, or rather the whites made it into Yonaluska, which means he who tries but fails. However, the fact that it was even a thing and that a name had to be given about it perhaps shows just how serious about this particular, shall we say, feelings of enemyhood that the Creeks and the Cherokees had. A lot of the other tribes they were fighting was seemingly for fun. The Creeks they really didn't like. Now, of course, at this point, during the early mid-19th century, the tribal wars were fading, since the rising power of the United States of America was coming in, and of course eventually led to the dissolution of the Cherokee nation in their ancient homelands and their removal to the Indian territories in Oklahoma. But that will be the subject perhaps of a later video. That was it. my story about the peace-loving Cherokee Indians and their attempts to, at the same time, defend their territories, but also just apparently seeming to have a bit of fun by fighting literally anyone they could get their hands on. I might later return to the subject with some tales about their fights against the whites, both colonist and later the United States of America. But for now, this was basically a sort of, yeah, these were the Cherokee Indians. This was how you become one of the most powerful nations in your given area. Constant warfare, it seems. So, to a certain degree, the world might even be said to have changed for the better. Until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.